How's it going, everybody? Happy April 26th. Towards the end of the month, I'm coming off my birthday weekend, so I'm feeling pretty good myself, and we're ready to drink some whiskey. I just got back from Austin, Texas, where we just opened up another restaurant, which is super exciting. And I am happy to be joined by Will Schragis from Stellum Spirits. And let Will introduce himself here in a minute, but just wanted to thank everyone for joining us for our April call featuring Stellum. And Will, we've had you on before. You've been a guest before, so some of our long-standing members may recognize the handsome face. So please, for our new members and those who maybe don't remember, please introduce yourself and tell us what you do at Stellum.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Will Schragis. I work for Barrell Craft Spirits and Stellum Spirits. And Trevor, thank you so much for having me back. If people remember, yes, I wear glasses now. I have gotten older since the beginning of the pandemic, and my eyesight has changed. I was the first employee of Barrell Craft Spirits, and then I worked with Joe, who's the owner and founder of Barrell, on developing Stellum Spirits. And it's really a love of mine. And so I'm so excited to be back and be able to do this call with you guys. My title is Chief Product Innovation Officer, which I understand is a mouthful, and I agree it is. Really, I like to joke that my job is whipping boy in the company, because I've been around for so long that whenever there's a new project that doesn't fall into someone else's job, it kind of becomes my job. But really, my job now is spending as much time in the market with people who love whiskey as I can, and working with Joe and Nick and Tripp, who are on the blending team, not only to help craft our whiskeys, but to make sure that we are developing and representing whiskeys for the whiskey industry and whiskey consumers that exists now, and not the idea of what bourbon and rye lovers might have wanted in the 90s. And so Stellum is a brand that is really dedicated to that. It's dedicated to being a modern brand in terms of its attitude and in terms of its minimalist branding, but also be really rooted in classic styles of bourbon and rye. We have Barrell Craft Spirits, which I know we have tasted on these calls before, which is a really sort of cutting edge of new blending techniques. And Stellum is a modern interpretation of really old blending profiles and blending techniques. And so I'm really excited to talk about single barrel rye today. It's one of my loves in the whiskey industry is single barrel rye. I in my private life drink more rye than probably any other style of whiskey. So I'm excited to, Trevor, talk to you about them. And
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, before we dive into it, we do have, as always, some exciting prizes to give away. We have a signed bottle of Barrel Vantage by owner and founder Joe Beatrice. And then the second place winner will be getting a Stellum beanie hat and travel mug. So some cool prizes to give away. So as always, if you're watching on YouTube, Facebook, just make sure you put your questions in the comment section, and make sure that the account you're signed in on is the name associated with your membership. And if it's not, just make sure you put your name that is associated with the membership. So we'll get to questions. And everyone for donating some cool prizes. So you talked about it a little bit, Will, but you just maybe want to give us a brief history of Stellum in general and how that kind of was born out of the Barrell portfolio and the Barrell brand.
Yeah. So in 2019 or so, Barrell had been around for 6 years, and we had more solidified our stocks of barrels that we sourced from many different distilleries. And we had this idea of trying to put together a flavor profile for bourbon first and then rye, but it really started with bourbon that was uniquely ours. Because we sourced from so many different distilleries, we work with distillate or with whiskey that is uniquely that of other people, but nothing that we ever produce really tastes like anything that is made or bottled or distilled in other places. And so we wanted to have a blend that was true to us and was greater than the sum of its parts, but also could never have been made in one place, could only have been put together by us. And so we spent like 2019 through the first quarter of 2021 putting together this blend. But with barrel craft spirits, we have this philosophy that you can't chase being the best and being the same at the same time. And so the like concept of let's make this amazing, unique profile of bourbon didn't fit into the barrel craft spirits portfolio. And so in 2021, we decided we're going to launch a brand or launch a sub company that is dedicated to extremely high quality consistency and also cask strength single barrels of bourbon and rye, which we're tasting obviously the single barrel rye right now. And we developed Stellum bourbon, we developed Stellum Rye, and then we also sourced single barrels that we felt were really in balance, but also like really classic expressions of bourbon and rye. They weren't off profile in an interesting way. They were like on profile in a delicious way. And so we started sort of sorting our focus between Barrell and Stellum, with Barrell being hyper quirky and also like unique, and Stellum being like the best example of bourbon and rye that we could possibly give people. And for me personally, because I love rye so much, the Stellum blended rye, the Stellum elevated, like the Fibonacci, the Stellum Black, Stellum Lone Cypress, but especially the Stellum single barrel ryes, which are all so unique to one another, are sort of my favorite thing to taste through in the portfolio. I have loved really high quality cask strength rye since I got into the whiskey industry. So that's kind of how Stellum started. So we worked on it for about 2 years before we had a name for it and before we knew exactly what it was going to be. And then we spent the last 6 months or so like figuring out how to explain to people what we had been working on. And it became Stellum.
Yeah, so you talked about like just the best expressions of rye and the best expressions of bourbon, but you also mentioned consistency. So I'm wondering, like, choosing to bottle everything at barrel proof. Obviously, you're showing the purest expression of that spirit, but obviously consistency is going to vary a little bit. Like, was there ever a conversation of maybe just releasing Stellum and proofing it down to like a 90 proof whiskey or maybe 100 proof? Like, what was the thought process behind doing things at barrel strength?
Yeah, I don't want to lie. We did have that conversation, but what it ultimately came to each time we talked about it is Joe and Tripp, Joe obviously has put together every blend that Barrell has ever released, and Tripp has been working with Joe since Barrell Bourbon Batch 2. They just like cask strength whiskey for a variety of reasons, and it felt like it was not true to our ethos to be adding water to the whiskey because it's Joe's favorite thing to drink. And so even though Barrell and Stellum are different philosophies, they're still the same company in a lot of ways. And our philosophy is that people should enjoy their whiskey the way that they want to. If people want to add water to it, but when you're bottling it, you should be doing it at cask strength. Or at least our whiskeys are at cask strength. And so we decided to continue with that. And from the single barrel perspective, it's really hard to know what's going to happen when you add water to something. And so either we would have to knock all of the barrels down to the same proof, or we would have to test every barrel at different proofs to decide where to knock it down. And neither one of those really make any sense from a production standpoint. If we're knocking all of them down to the same proof, we're not going to get the best quality out of all of them. And if we're having to test each one, there's just so much work that goes into each single barrel that it wouldn't be. It's more realistic for us to taste and analyze and smell all of the barrels at cask strength and bottle them at the place in which we designated them to be a good single barrel.
Got it. And so you guys are sourcing whiskey. Do you source from the same places? Do you source Stellum from the same places you're sourcing for Barrell, or is there a differentiation, or is it, how does that pan out?
Yes and no. There are many, many more sources for Barrell than there are for Stellum, but there's a lot of overlap, and some barrels that we have owned for a long time or sourced more recently, we don't know where they're going when we first source them, and some of them we source them for very specific things. Stellum in general is more focused on the big 3-letter Indiana distillery than Barrell is. Barrell is a lot more Kentucky and Tennessee. And so the single barrels, these are all MGP, they're all Indiana. And it's not that all of the Stellum blends come from there, but when we're doing Stellum single barrels, we really want to express that really wonderful contract distillate, which so many people love through the Stellum single barrels. So I think we're one of the only people that really do it on a large scale at cask strength.
So what are you looking for when you're sourcing barrels, specifically for rye, because that's what we have here? Are there certain flavor profiles that you're looking for Stellum, or is it more just like it when you taste it, or how's that work?
So in general, to me, and I think to our whole company, but I guess I'll speak for myself the most, the difference between a good barrel for a blend and a good barrel for a single barrel is that a good barrel for a blend plays a role. So it doesn't have to be in balance. It has to be extreme in one way or another so that it can speak within the blend without just getting covered up by other things. A barrel that's a good single barrel is a barrel that has its own more developed persona, cadence, structure, flavor profile. It's not all just one thing, or it's not dominated by one thing, or it doesn't have off notes that might be able to get blended out. So it has to be like sort of the more complete package, but it sometimes has to be more subtle because you want the experience of a complete whiskey without adding anything to it. So I find with single barrels, usually what you're looking for is a barrel that has one driving characteristic that will make people remember it, and has one or two secondary characteristics that make it interesting. Whereas if it had just that one driving characteristic, then it would be a really powerful blending component. And if it has too many things going on, then it's not interesting enough to be a single barrel by itself. Then it's like a filler barrel, if you will. So I know that there's so many people in the club, and we sent you, I don't even know, 20 samples or whatever it is. So there's a couple of different barrels that people have, but each one I hope has like the driving characteristic and then the like important secondary. There's like the conductor, and there's the first violin, and then there's like the hot shot timpani player. And like you need, some version of all three of those in a single barrel.
That's good. That's going to be my new band name is Hot Shot Timpani Player.
Hot Timpani. I'll be in the band with you.
Yeah, you guys sent me this one. It was actually kind of a pull back the curtain a little bit. So when we do barrel picks, there's a few ways that it happens. Most commonly is the distillery sending me, a dozen samples, sometimes more, and saying, choose X amount that's going to yield enough for your members. Mm-hmm. And it's typically anywhere between 6 and 8 barrels. So we chose 7 barrels this time. So there's 7 different expressions of this single barrel pick that out there amongst our members, and they'll vary in proof and flavor profile quite a bit. But I always, and sometimes I'm making the picks just, by myself at my house, just, drinking whiskey and seeing what I like. But I always like to include others as much as possible. And we were in a hotel lobby in Cerritos, California, and I had like 20, or I think about 15 of these picks. And there was it was funny because we started the tasting and we were tasting, 12 to 15 different whiskeys. And, some people bowed out after a few just from pure, drinking cask strength whiskey. I think it was on like a Thursday night. So by the end of it, I think there was only like 4 of us, but, it was a really kind of collaborative effort amongst myself and a couple of our regional directors and Taylor in our marketing department, who helps me run this club, and it does a lot of the work behind the scenes, and just seeing bouncing off of each other. So, as you're tasting your whiskey tonight, maybe put in the comments what proof you got. The one I'm drinking is 118.34 proof. And we did all these tasting notes, and we selected 7 barrels when it came down to it. But it's so amazing how like just, similar characteristics in a lot of things, but some barrels just stand out more than others. And, we think we chose the best barrels that we were given to choose from. And
it's interesting, the canon of American rye is so narrow because the rules are so strict. And when you're tasting ryes of the same mash bill from the same distillery, there's not a whole lot that can be different about them. And so it's fascinating how quickly your brain readjusts to focusing on the differences rather than the similarities. And I love when you're tasting by committee, there's this like sweet spot where it's enough people that nobody can dominate, but it's few enough that there's the chance that everyone points at the same sample at the same time. And like, that's the sweet spot to me, of especially when you have to pick 5 or 7 out of 15 or 20 of like certain things just rise to the top by committee in a really fun way.
Do you know what is the mash bill on this? Do you know?
These are 95% rye, 5% malted barley.
Awesome. Can you tell us? I don't think I recall this, but I know I asked you on the last time we did this about 1.5 years ago when we talked about Stellum, when we did their bourbon, which I actually just killed my Stellum bourbon bottle a couple weeks ago, which is delicious as well. Well, what's the meaning behind the name Stellum?
So Stellum is a like made up word, but a bastardization of stellium or stelliar, which means of the stars in Greek and Latin. It's like the root that we then took a different, a little bit of the name and the bottle and the label had to do with us wanting there to be some sort of vibe or theme to the brand, because Barrell is so passionately, this is just good whiskey, there's no BS to cut through. We wanted a motif with Stellum, and we had this meeting while we were talking about it where Joe like proverbially put his fist on the table and was like, I was a Cold War kid, like I love space exploration, so we wanted to do outer space, but not futuristic outer space. We wanted to do like dusty outer space. And similarly, as Barrell evolved, we kind of knew a project like Stellum was going to happen eventually. And so we kind of felt like it was in the stars. And so we when you're deciding on the name of a brand, you can either give it your own name, and Joe did not want to call this Beatrice whiskey.
You didn't want to call it what?
They didn't want to call it Joe Beatrice whiskey. So like, you can give it your own name. You can call it Jefferson or whatever. Not that Trey's name is Jefferson, but like you can name it after a person or yourself. You can give it a word that already exists, which is more and more difficult because so many words are used by someone in the wine and spirit space already, or you can make up a word. And so we decided we wanted to give it a name that was a new word, but we wanted it to have some sort of root in something that meant something within the development of the brand. And so we did a lot of workshopping on roots of words that meant outer space, and we came up with Stellum. We also really liked the way that it looked on the bottle. We really liked the 2 L's as a callback to Barrell. We did not realize that it was mullets backwards, but then we figured that out after we chose it, and we love it. So like we're gonna keep, we're happy that it was a happy accident.
I cut my hair into a mullet-like haircut about 8 months ago, and it lasted for a few months. And then my wife came to me one day and she said, "I think we're done with this."
I when I was younger, used to go and work on farms in Italy over the summer as a way to travel for free. And I had this tradition that for July 4th, I would shave my beard and I'd have just a mustache. And I have kept it up even if I'm not traveling, that I like have a mustache for July 4th. And this year, actually, my partner Poppy and I are going to Italy over the summer, and we're going to be there on July 4th. And we are negotiating whether I can have the mustache while we're there together.
You got to do it. You can't break tradition.
Yeah, I can't break tradition, but we'll see. I also I can't break tradition, but I don't want to ruin a vacation.
maybe just don't shave it all completely. Maybe just like trim it down a little bit. And just,
maybe like one dinner, I'll like shave and I'll have the mustache, and then I'll shave the mustache too, and I'll be
just for at least the picture.
I'll be Guglielmo for one dinner.
Nice. So let's talk about this specifically. You know, like I said, everyone has different flavor profiles. I have the 118.34 proof, which I think was one of the strongest proofs out there. I see some people in the chat saying, Mark Valpreda says 115.56. Derek Scarton says 117.48. Sarah Steepleton got 115.04. Some people drinking it with ice, other people drinking it neat. I'm drinking it neat. I have my notes here, you know, on all the barrels we tasted, and just kind of like, I wish I would have written down the proof of them, but you know, obviously a lot of floral rye spice going on here, along with quite a bit of fruitiness. I do get some caramel, some cereal sweetness. And I'm just going through general notes from all the barrels that we tasted. Marshmallow was something that popped up on a couple of them. Butterscotch. I forget which one it was, but if you have something that just tastes like a straight cinnamon bomb, that's literally was just my note on one of the barrels, is just put cinnamon bomb, which is one of the barrels we did choose. But, you know, they should all fairly taste the same, just with little different nuances. I was in preparation for this call. I poured myself a pre-call whiskey, and one of the unique characteristics I got here was like a sweet peach tea, like a lot of fruit characteristic in the middle, then finishing off with kind of this dry tea. I also get a lot of floral white flowers, but I still get that butterscotch, caramel, you know, traditional whiskey flavors, but a lot of that fruity and floralness coming from the rye spice here, being a 95.5 rye whiskey. I don't know, Will, what are some flavor profiles you typically get out of these 95.5 ryes from MGP?
So I find that rye obviously gives you what people call spice a lot, but I find it as more of this like wintergreen herbaceousness.
Yeah.
And, because there's when we talk about herbs and the like taste and the smells of herbs in whiskey, there's actually two very different things. There's cogeners that come from distillate, and then there's cogeners that come from wood. And dill comes from wood. American oak, like.
Can you tell us what cogeners mean?
Cogeners are like the molecules in whiskey that give it flavor that isn't ethanol and isn't water. So I assume there's one or two STEM people here, like esters, ethers, aldehydes, ketones, like all of those different higher alcohols, oil, like volatile, all of that stuff. Cogener is like a catch-all word for it's not alcohol and it's not water and it has flavor. Cogener.
Cool.
And
thank you.
American oak, which is what 99% of American rye barrels are aged in, famously gives dill as a flavor. However, a lot of distillate has like piney, wintergreeny, especially rye distillate, sometimes even like rosemary or oregano, like fresh oregano notes. And so a lot of times the dill and the distillate herbaceousness get lumped together as something being really herbaceous. But one is it being very woody and the others are it being very distillate forward. And in general, for us, when we're looking for single barrels, we're looking for things that the whiskey is speaking a little bit more than the barrel is. And so I find with the 95.5 single barrels that make it into our single barrel program, they usually have this like dried, twangy, herbaceous character rather than a like vanilla dill, soft herbaceous character. And I really love that. Like my favorite ryes to me smell like mix between Christmas trees and like toasted rosemary, like somewhere in between those two things.
No, that's, I mean, now that you say that kind of wintergreen thing, I'm definitely picking that up. Which, again, we talk about all the time. People say something and then you're like, oh yeah, I absolutely do smell or taste that. Kind of unlocks it for you. Trying to see in the comments here if anybody else has any tasting notes that they're picking up on theirs.
I think also what's interesting about 95.5 as a mash bill is because there's no corn, because it's all rye and malted barley, there's sometimes a little bit of a like creaminess or milk chocolate quality from the malted barley, because there's like more maltiness shows than some other mash bills as well. And I think some of the barrels show that a little bit too.
Awesome. Speaking of chocolate, you reminded me about our snack this month, which is from Fine and Rob, actually out of New York as well.
Nice.
Small chocolate company that makes some great chocolates that I found recently at a trade show and just kind of fell in love with the brand. Super cool branding. So we have their Alderwood smoked sea salt here. Just going to try a little bit with the whiskey. Chocolate and whiskey, I don't think you go bad with that.
Yeah. It's interesting. I prefer milk chocolate with whiskey. I think people associate dark chocolate with whiskey a little bit more because whiskey has more dark chocolate notes. But I like that bit of sweetness and like milk fat to contrast with the like difficulty of the whiskey sometimes.
No, absolutely. We're going to dive into questions here in a minute, but we talked a little bit about before the call. So as we've been doing the past few months since the beginning of the year, because we're putting together our playlist, I asked you to pick a couple songs that you felt represented Stellum Rye, and I will ask that you share that with us now. And then I have a couple songs too. Yeah.
So you gave me a little bit of notes on this, so I got to think about it a little bit. And for you, of course, and other people who have been around when I've been here, I think everyone could agree that my favorite pastime is overthinking questions. And so the first one I picked is off of MGMT's original EP called, it's a song called Electric Feel, in like, I don't know, 2010 or so.
Yeah. I think it was earlier than that. Sorry.
Yeah, but it was 9, 10, whatever it was. I think of that as a modern song, even though it's not anymore. But it's sort of my
half the music I listen to is from 25 years ago. So everything still feels modern.
That era to me is like my marker for new music versus old music, is like that plus anything beyond that. And I feel like Stellum is this really modern company, but we are also like very rooted in wanting to understand where bourbon and rye came from and have a classic profile. And so Electric Feel to me, both because it's this like kind of feel good song, but also helped define this new genre, whereas cast strength rye at that moment was like, there were not very many out and it was like starting to become a thing. I just think of that era in whiskey as like the beginning of where we are now. And something about electric eels feel piney and herbaceous, and like that song just like seems very green to me, and this is like a very green rye. And so I picked that song. And the second one, so Nick Christensen on our blending team is like the very, very stereotypic in the like cerebral blending stereotype, I guess is the best word. She listens to really repetitive modern classical music when she's blending. She likes background music, but like very contemplative background music. And there was this piece by Philip Glass, from the Carducci String Quartet number 3, Mishima, which I remember playing when I was working with her on the Stellum Rye blend the first time and tasting through it. And so since you asked for like a song that I associate with Stellum Rye,
yeah, That's cool.
that song, like I'm not familiar with the song particularly, so I had to go find it when you asked me this question. And I went to Spotify with Philip Glass and listened to the first like 30 seconds of like 20 different songs until I was like, that was the one that was playing. So those are my two Stellum Rye songs.
That's cool. I mean, that's awesome that like it actually relates to something about kind of how the whiskey was made, with that specific song.
Yeah, and I think it's a feel good whiskey and it's a very cerebral whiskey at the same time.
Yeah. Well, my picks aren't going to be as thoughtful as that, I guess, but obviously you have some more background in the production. But I'm going to go with Wildflowers by Tom Petty. I get a lot of floral characteristics from this. Even though it has a high proof, I feel like it kind of just has a lot of characteristics where I'd want to drink it on just like a breezy spring day. And then the second, I know we talked about these songs ahead of time, so I'm going back and forth between two picks, but I think I'm going to stick with my original pick, which was Good Directions by Billy Currington. Great classic country song. Well, depending on what you define as classic, I'm talking like, 15, 20 years ago. So not like classic, but I get that peach tea characteristic, and it kind of just reminds me of the South and a good country song. And I think that's a good country song. So, and then I'll do a third alternate was Peaches by the Presidents of the United States of America. Just because you said 4th of July in your mustache, I just thought about that song for some reason. And obviously the peaches tie in because I get my particular bottle, I'm getting all of that peach tea characteristic. So again, we're still compiling these songs. We're trying to put a playlist together.
Yeah, I can't wait for this playlist.
Yeah. So I think those are some good picks. So we do also have a cocktail that Will and his team came up with as part of the box. So again, I just got back from Austin a few hours ago. I apologize, I did not have time to make the syrups, but it is a delicious cocktail called Punch Kit, and it has a chai syrup, some fresh squeezed lemon juice, pineapple juice, amaretto, and just sounds delicious. So hope everyone gets a chance to be able to make that cocktail. So I think we'll dive into some questions from the audience here, because we got quite a few already. So Brendan Franco asks, when it comes to blending or finishing a whiskey, are there any specific notes you look for in a barrel that pair well with certain finishes? I'm assuming he's talking about barrel craft here. And are there any barrels you've tried that stand out, and what made them stand out?
So, I mean, Brendan, that's a great question, because there aren't necessarily specific things you look for, but there are trends or like attitudes in barrels that you look for. And what we feel is most important when you're putting a blend together is a blend should be more than just a bunch of stuff dumped in the same vat. Things should be there with purpose. And so we look for sets of barrels that can give attributes at different moments in the experience in the whiskey. And so a lot of times what you're looking for is barrels that like one set of barrels that has, or one component whiskey that has a really beautiful nose, and one component whiskey that has a really beautiful finish, and then one component whiskey that will give you structure or backbone in the middle. So like a lot of times I love, like, since this seems to be a music themed recording now, there's a term in the writing of music called a cadence, where something reaches a point and then kind of falls off afterwards. It's like it reaches like its most exciting moment, and then you have the end of the song. It doesn't end in a high point. It ends with a like sign off afterwards. And so I really like whiskeys that build and then have either a very tannic structure in the mid palate or a very sweet moment in the mid palate. And then that dissipates and you get the finish is interesting. It's different than what you would have expected. And so that usually doesn't come from one whiskey. That comes from putting together whiskeys that are able to be very loud at different moments in the experience of smelling and tasting them without covering each other up. The challenge with that is sometimes you have things that ruin what's exciting about each other. So you want things that add to the experience, not cloud each other's experience within a blend. And there's this term in the alcohol world, but really in the like science of human experience on the palate, called perception threshold. And that is, is there a high enough percentage of one or a set of molecules that the human experience can perceive them? And a lot of times when you have a single barrel, you've got a lot of interesting flavors and smells, and even like structural components that are just above the perception threshold. So you can taste them. But if you take something that's 20 parts per million above the average human perception threshold and you blend it with a barrel that has something that's 22 parts per million less than the average human perception threshold, it's going to disappear out of one of them. So it's not going to be the sum of, it's either there or it's not there. And so when you're blending, a lot of times it's about picking and choosing the things that are going to be loud enough that they will stay in the blend with, even as they get diluted by other barrels afterwards. It's also like, even though blending at cask strength is really difficult to keep the whiskey in balance, it does help you in terms of understanding a little bit the strength of each component whiskey as it's going into the blend, because you're not worried about what water is going to do to it at the end. We never use water, so we don't have to deal with this. But in my sort of conversations with other blending houses, there's a debate about whether you should blend something and then water it down, or if you should water all of the ingredients down to the same proof and then blend them, because the latter is much easier from a production standpoint and you don't necessarily ruin ingredients. But the former, blending first and watering it down is easier from a production standpoint, but watering everything down and then blending them gives you a little bit more control. Luckily, we don't have to deal with that at all because everything's at cask strength. But it is making sure we don't blend out of what's exciting about certain barrels or component whiskeys is like actually probably the hardest part of putting together the final blends.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that was a great answer to that question. Michael Osur asks, since every Stellum barrel is unique, how are you able to define what Stellum tastes like?
So the Stellum single barrel program is a single barrel program. Everyone is supposed to be a little bit different, but it's the same group of people who are putting a lens to each expression and saying this falls into the profile or the experience that fits Stellum to us. And so Stellum single barrels to us have to be delicious. They have to be expressive of being 95.5 if they're a 95.5 mash bill. And they have to be on profile for American rye. We want to, if someone's going to have a Stellum single barrel in their house, we want them to be able to make rye cocktails with it without them being peculiar versions of the cocktail. So even though the barrels are very different, they will not make it into the Stellum single barrel program if they are off profile, even if they're fascinating and off profile. If they're fascinating and off profile, they'll probably get moved into the barrel program, into the like barrel craft spirits program. And so though all of them are different, they are sorted into Stellum for being beautiful expressions of what you expect from good American rye.
Now, so when you're tasting barrels of rye, are you specifically keeping that in mind as far as like, this is going to Stellum, this is going to barrel, like depending on the flavor profile?
It's very rare that we move barrels from one sort of concept to the other concept, because a lot of times we know what we're looking at by the time we're tasting for single barrels. It does happen, but it's rare. It is more that a Stellum single barrel to us should be indicative of what we want out of Stellum, which is piney, herbaceous, punchy. It has to be in balance because it won't go into the single barrel program if it's out of balance. It'll be used as an ingredient. In fact, it might be a better ingredient if it's out of balance. So it has to be something that is a good, complete whiskey, even as a single barrel. But it also needs to be what we expected from it, because we don't want anyone to have any surprises. We want someone who likes Stellum to be excited about every bottle of Stellum they buy, no matter what. And there are great single barrel programs with bad or unexpected barrels in them in America, and we don't want Stellum ever to get a reputation like that. So we're very, very careful about what makes it into the single barrel program.
Cool. Clark White says, as someone who plays an active role in production development, what would you like to see Stellum do next?
What Stellum has been working on recently, which, one day we may do with you, Trevor, and this not in a sales way. I'm just, it fits into what you guys do here too.
It's okay. We'll be like you.
No, it's more like Stellum. We have our core bourbon, we have our core rye, we have the single barrel program, and then we have these what we call Stellum Blacks or Stellum Specialties, which are these one-time concept blends that we make. And increasingly, what we are starting to do is inviting groups of people to be a little bit more involved in the development of a Stellum concept with us. And so what I'm really excited about to work on with Stellum is bringing groups that want to make a big blend. And it's not that we invite people to come sit with us and blend the whole time, but we talk about what people are looking for. We taste through old expressions of Stellum and what direction people would like us to push it in, and what sort of, from an ethos standpoint, that blend, their expression of Stellum would be like. And we work with them on making Stellum feel unique to one set of people or one whiskey group or one retail chain or one restaurant group or whatever it is. And I really like that because it's like, we do so much open-ended blending at Barrell, and having one or two projects going at a time where there's actually like kind of a goal in mind, where there's a brief, is a slightly different muscle for us to flex, which is really fun. And it allows me to like work on a pretty detailed level with people in the industry that I haven't worked with before. And that's really exciting to me.
Cool. This next question is regarding the barrel releases we did this month, which were available to our Whiskey Club members. In addition to getting this box, we released the Barrell German Ice Vine finish whiskey, as well as the Barbados rum whiskey. And Mark Valpreda wants to know, how do you choose different finishing barrels like German ice wine barrels?
So a lot of it is just sort of experimentation, but the first thing we do when we have a out of the box idea, because there's a lot of finishes in the barrel universe, like PX sherry or Barbados rum, that we get the barrel, we put whiskey in it, and then we adjust the whiskey as it's sitting in the barrel with different whiskeys. But we know it's going to taste good because there's so much history of that finish tastes good on whiskey.
Yeah.
With some of the more exotic ones, what we'll do to start is we will soak an oak chip in the thing that the barrel was before, and then we will drop it into a whiskey for a day or so, just to make sure that it doesn't taste strange. There are certain barrels that just don't do good things to whiskey. And
can you give us an example of one that has tasted strange that you didn't like?
This isn't necessarily a barrel example, but I have trouble with savory red wine finishes unless it was new oak on the red wine. So something like Napa Cab, it's new oak. That oak never saw any distillate. It only saw wine, which is 15% alcohol. And so you get the savory and tan quality and the tannin of the wine, but you also get the hemicellulose and the sweetness of the oak at the same time, and it works. I have seen, even though there are some scotches that are super old that end up working because they oxidize and they get really interesting and savory, I've seen a lot of like Bordeaux and like Côte Rôtie and like just like finishes that like it was a second or third or fourth use barrel that had really savory wine in it. And I'm not saying there aren't good whiskeys like that, but I would be very hesitant putting 50 gallons of whiskey into I don't know, Chianti Classico barrel, because I know that barrel has been used a bunch of times on purpose so as to not be too impactful to the wine. And that wine is delicious and stemmy, but it also has like a lot of ethyl acetate and like really earthy qualities to it. And I just don't know what it would do to the whiskey. I would want to test that extensively before you invested, $5,000 worth of whiskey into it.
Cool. Matt Vargo says,
hold on,
Trevor.
Trevor.
I lost you there for a second.
Yeah,
sorry. Since Will made the violin conductor timpani reference, do you have any musical background? And if this rye was a musical genre, what would it be? We kind of already talked about that, but
yeah. So I have a little bit of a musical background. I'm by no means a musician. I played instruments through high school, and then I was a percussion minor in college. So I'm like literate in music, but not talented, if that makes sense. But I listen to a lot of music, and I think the wine and spirits industry and the music industry overlap for a lot of reasons, partially because a lot of people in the hospitality and wine and spirits industry got here through the music industry for one reason or another, but also because there's this duality of math and study and also romance and creativity that happens when you are making stuff, whether it's music or booze. And I think that like the way that I think of Stellum is this like very carefully produced pop music would be the way that I think of it. Of like there's pop songs that are catchy and fun, and there's pop songs where you like dig into it and you're like, okay, that was the people putting this together could have been classical composers if they wanted to be, but they're interested in doing pop stuff. Not that I necessarily think of it as a Stellum, but I every once in a while like listen really closely to Girls Just Want to Have Fun, and the like production value of that song, if you really listen to like all of the finishing of that mix, is so good that it makes me want to look up who was in the studio. And that's what
Opera is a big whiskey drinker.
Yeah. That's what I want people to think of with Stellum. That I want, first and foremost, I want people to be like, this is the best $55-$60 I've ever spent on a bottle of whiskey. And then I want people to think like, this is fascinating. Like, who was in the studio when this got put together? And for them to realize that it was like a bunch of people that like care really deeply about the blend or the selection. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, I think the correlation between music and the hospitality industry is definitely. I mean, I am a former musician turned hospitality professional. I wasn't like a classically trained. I played in punk bands from the time I was 14 until I was about 23, but then bartended and.
I think that like you almost never do you find someone who like their whole life said, I'm going to be in the hospitality or I'm going to be in the booze industry. It's almost always like people who found a profession doing something else. And so there's a lot of,
I think that's fair.
A lot of music background.
Both have creative, both have a lot of creativity. So a few more questions here. So Matt Archer asked, what, with the Stellum brand being more consistent from batch to batch, what would you say sets Stellums apart from other core competitors?
Yeah, I think that the answer to that sort of speaks to, I think, what I've been talking to a lot, that the goal of Stellum is not to be drastically different. It's to be the best expression for what it is and also the value. And again, at fear of seeming too salesy, like I feel like Stellum is the highest quality bottle of whiskey you can get in this style at the price that you buy it for. And so you get a little bit of really modern of this time whiskey expertise. But really what you get is like a lot of people that have won a lot of awards for putting together blends and picking single barrels, and in the past 10 years that are focused on a slightly different goal, which is if you're a bourbon drinker, giving you a great bourbon, if you're a rye drinker, giving you a great rye. And so I think that is what sets us apart from competition. Although I think in terms of modern brands and new age brands and, non-heritage brands, it's not so much competition. It's a little bit more rising tide attitude, because the hope is that people consider this many whiskeys instead of this many whiskeys. And if someone loves Stellum and also loves New Riff, I'm glad they love New Riff, because that means that they're trying new things. It means that they're going to taste Barrell too. And if someone loves Wilderness Trail and they love Starlight, then I hope that they eventually try Stellum, and I'm sure they'll love that too. Someone says, I'm a Jack Daniels guy, I'll always be a Jack Daniels guy. I don't want to tell someone how to live their life or how to enjoy it, but it's a much harder, my job is a lot harder to get them to consider Stellum if they haven't considered other things before. And so I don't really see Stellum so much, we're in competition with ourselves about being the best whiskey that we can be. I know that sounds like bullshit, but if you get off of that concept, you end up chasing a different set of goals. And if the goal is to be the best whiskey you can, build it and they will come, is really how I try to live my life.
Matt also wants to know how I feel about the Jets getting Aaron Rodgers, and that's a question here. So cautiously optimistic. If you don't know about me, I'm a Jets fan.
My father's a huge Jets fan.
Yeah, it's a tough life.
I remember listening to the Midnight Miracle on the radio as a kid.
Well, we haven't had too much positivity as a fan base.
Yeah, I actually, a year ago, I read a econ abstract from the little younger sister of one of my friends or something, who did the analysis on if you had bet against the Jets since 1990, they're the team you would have made the most money. They just the combination of losing games and missing the spread when they won or lost. They're the least successful Vegas franchise since 1990, which I think is really funny.
It's a very Jets thing to.
There's a lot of teams that have been worse over that time, but those teams have been more predictably bad, and the Jets have just barely sneaked out a win when they should have won by a lot and lost by.
Well, if the Jets do anything good, it's letting people down. So yeah. It doesn't surprise me. So we'll see. But moving on. Sorry, some people here follow me on social media, and I posted some stuff about the Jets earlier.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask you now, but now I'm curious how you feel. But we can talk about that offline.
Yeah, cautiously optimistic. Those are the best words I can use. Mark Matson asked, what has been Stellum's biggest happy accident, in quotes, if there has been one?
I think I already mentioned that's the fact that Stellum is mullets backwards.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. We very much believe in happy accident is not what we're looking for. We want to be pretty sure that things are going to work before we start to use them. And if they are not going the way that we wanted, we want to pivot into a new project. And so we do not want to walk backwards into a good blend. We want to visualize a good blend and execute it. But the name was a happy accident. Backwards was definitely a happy accident.
Yeah, of course. I will do one more question here, Will, and then we'll choose a couple winners, and then we will call it a night. It's been great talking to you as always. Courtney Knitter asks, oops, I just lost my place. Found the congener detail very interesting. Do you have any other fun distilling science facts that might aid in tasting notes or flavor profile? There's probably too many to mention, so maybe.
I love fun distilling science facts. Okay. And forgive me if people have heard me mention this before, because this is my favorite actually. And I've in 3 years of being stuck inside and being on YouTube and whatever interviews, you end up having a shtick even if you don't want one. So when yeast is hot, it often makes, as it is fermenting sugar, especially corn sugar, but also grape sugar, other things, it makes a acetic acid, which is essentially vinegar, acetic acid. And so when you're talking about wine or beer and it seems vinegary, a lot of times the reason that it tastes that way is because it was a non-temperature controlled fermentation, which is delicious in a lot of scenarios, but is not what people are looking for if they want a really clean wine or beer or whatever it is. What's fascinating about acetic acid is that in the presence of oxygen, acetic acid oxidizes into a molecule called ethyl acetate, which smells like paint thinner. Ethyl acetate has almost exactly the same boiling point as ethanol. Not exactly, but almost exactly the same boiling point. And so a gigantic, really industrial and well-executing column still will be able to pull ethanol and ethyl acetate separately off of different plates. But a pot still is going to be really difficult to separate those two because they're going to vaporize at almost exactly the same time and rate because their boiling point is the same. And so when you are tasting micro distillery bourbon in America and it tastes like paint thinner, the reason is usually that the fermentation was too hot. And
now, is that similar to like autolysis?
What?
Autolysis in beer is when like a dying yeast cell produces an off flavor, but sometimes it produces flavors of like, this is going to not sound great, but it is a thing. It's like rotten meat.
Yeah, I think what's interesting when beer is like yeast in beer often doesn't produce what people are looking for, but there's a lot of wine that relies on autolysis for like yeast falling apart and putting proteins into it. But what I find so interesting about the like acetic acid ethyl acetate thing is like people, it's not a distillation problem, it's not a corn problem, it's not a barrel problem, it's not even an age problem. It's like a fermentation. It's like a temperature. Someone needed to like move that fermenter to the basement or like put it in stainless steel and run cold water around it in the summer. It's like a lot of times distilleries when they're first starting up aren't able to control for things seasonally and stuff like that. And a lot of people think that micro distillery bourbon isn't as good in America, which I disagree with. There's so much amazing micro distillery distillate in America being made right now. However, the control on it is not as good. And so it's like people don't really learn about the fermentation being that important, but all of the building blocks of making good whiskey start with good fermentation. And the big distilleries, one of the things that they do really well is they have extremely consistent fermentation. Makes for less interesting, but more consistent whiskey. Anyway, that's
definitely it's interesting. Well, I'll leave you with this before we choose the best questions. This is not really a question, but Sarah Steepleton says, "Will you come across like a sexy scientist?"
Thank you. Here's to all of the people who loved physics. Like, yeah, go into whiskey, and then people will say nice things to you.
Can you hear? I feel like I'm breaking up a little bit. Sorry.
I can hear you now. Yeah,
can you hear me?
I lost. Yeah.
Cool. All right, let's run through these and let's choose a couple of winners. So we have Brendan Franco who asks about blending and finishing, looking for specific characteristics, and are there barrels that you tried that stand out and what made it stand out? Michael Osur asks, how are you able to define what Stellum tastes like, even though the barrels are unique? Clark White asks what you think Stellum's going to do next. What would you like to see Stellum do next? Mark Valpreda asked a question about the finishing of the barrels and the German fine. Matt Vargo asked the question about your musical background.
Yeah.
And
I think my two favorite questions were Matt Vargo asking about music, and then who was it? It was Courtney Knitter asking me to be a nerd, because I just wish people have asked me that my whole life.
All right, now I get the hard job as always. I think kind of the overwhelming theme of the interview tonight was very kind of more science related kind of questions and diving into the science element of making whiskey. So I think, Courtney, you're going to get our number one prize tonight, which is the signed bottle of Barrell Vantage. And then Matt Vargo, we will send you the Stellum beanie and the Stellum mug. And we will be reaching out to get your information and to get that out to you. But Will, always a pleasure, sir.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to the next one. Let us know whatever we can do for you guys in the club, and I'm excited to visit the location in Austin. I've eaten at the I've eaten at the Austin downtown. It's a second location in Austin.
So it's a new concept. So it's called La Popular CDMX. It's a Mexican concept. It's our second location that we've opened, and we're excited to, in addition to the Eureka brand, we're excited to launch this new brand. So you can look it up. It's on Instagram at lapopular.cdmx. And yeah, we're excited to open in Austin. We're opening in Vegas in a couple of months, and just fun stuff all around. But until next time, sir, we appreciate your time. And
thank you so much for having me.
Cheers.
Yep. I got a little bit left.